Today we're going to be talking about seedless plants. And although most plants use seeds because it's a very effective way to reproduce, there are still a large number of plants that do not produce seeds in order to reproduce. Some of the groups that don't use seeds would be green algae, the bryophytes, which includes liverworts, hornworts, and some mosses, and then there are even some seedless vascular plants. And remember, we talked about the vascular system. This is a system that plants use to transport water and materials throughout the plant structures. Seedless vascular plants in particular would be the club mosses, the horsetails, and the ferns. So a lot of these seedless plants are older versions of plants. The seeds came along later, and then the flowers came along, and that's where most plants fall now, is in that angiosperm category. But there are lots of seedless plants still remaining out there. Instead of using a seed, a seedless plant is going to reproduce using spores. And so these spores will act as the gametes, and they are going to carry the genetic information just like a seed would, or just like a sperm would, or an egg cell, or any of those types of things. So still carrying genetic information, just not using a seed, which is what we commonly see in most terrestrial plants. Ferns are a very common seedless vascular plant. They have strong roots and underground stems, which are called rhizomes. The leaves are called fronds. They can live in areas with very little light, and the habitats are typically wet. The large plant that we recognize as a fern is the sporophyte stage of its life. So ferns are the large split leaves. Again, these are an older version of a plant. They evolved much earlier than the common plants that we see, like deciduous trees and the flowering plants that we see. As the fern matures, the haploid spores form on the underside of its fronds, so on the underside of those leaves. The spores grow into tiny heart-shaped gametophytes. Once the spore leaves and begin developing on its own, the gametophyte stage is completely independent of the sporophyte stage. The gametophyte produces sperms and egg that are later released for fertilization. So again, still got the egg and the sperm, but instead of putting it in a seed, we put it in this spore. The eggs are attached to the plant, and the sperm must have water to swim to the egg and fertilize it. Again, this is why we find ferns in wet environments, because they need to have that water. That habitat needs to have water there. Once fertilized, then it is going to develop into a sporophyte. Another seedless plant is green algae. This plant isn't vascular. Algae are usually classified as protist, but green algae has many characteristics like land plants, such as cell walls, which are made of cellulose, and chloroplast that contain chlorophyll for photosynthesis. So that is why they get the designation of being in the plant category, as opposed to a protist like other members of the algae family, like the blue-green algae or cyanobacteria, something like that. They usually live in fresh water or salt water. They absorb moisture and nutrients from their surroundings. They lack a lot of the tissues that we see in other plants, so they don't have the xylem and phloem system. And really that just, is dependent on the fact that it's algae and it doesn't have to grow vertically. So if it's not growing vertically, then there's no need to have a system of transporting materials up and down. Algae is just going to grow across surfaces, and it's all going to be horizontal, so you don't have to fight the forces of gravity. Therefore, there's no system needed to move those materials against gravity. Green algae reproduces asexually through mitosis. Typically, that's what it's going to use, and when conditions become unfavorable, then they will produce sexually. So they have the option of doing both. Most organisms, plants included, prefer to produce sexually, simply because it provides genetic variation, which is going to make that species more stable in times of change and in times of kind of distress. The haploid gamete spores begin the life cycle. The gametes fuse to form a diploid zygote, which can remain inactive for weeks or even months. Then when conditions become favorable again, it's going to go through meiosis and produce haploid cells again. Green algae can live in a lot of different forms. Some live in colonies, like the species Volvox. Some form long chains of cells. It really just depends on the conditions where the algae is growing, what type of green algae is going to be the best fit for that environment. Like most things we see, whatever the best fit for their environment are going to take that form, because that's most likely to make them most successful. Another group of seedless plants are the bryophytes. They are multicellular, and they have specialized structures. The most common bryophytes are mosses. So again, these are the older version of plants, not growing vertically. They lack true tissues like leaves, stems, roots, and in place of roots, they have root-like filaments, which are called rhizoids, and that helps hold them in place. Because mosses, they grow on rock and they grow on trees and things like that, but they're not just laying there. They're actually rooted there and stuck there so that, they don't get moved by wind or water or those types of things. The rhizoids in these bryophytes are going to absorb the water and the minerals, so acting in the same way that a root system would in a tree or an angiosperm. The mosses also have a very thin, waxy coat to keep them from drying out, so that's an important feature that we find like in leaves, right? That waxy coating, the cuticle that we find on leaves, which prevents too much evaporation and too much water loss. As a moss, you don't have those other structures. You don't have bark and you don't have leaves and you don't have flowers and all these other things. The moss itself is the organism. So it's important to keep them from drying out because they need to maintain that water so that they can reproduce. They absorb water through osmosis, but they can't draw water up very far, which limits their height. Again, they're going to grow mostly across surfaces, not going to grow vertically because they lack that vascular system. The life cycle is dominant in the gametophyte stage. The sporophyte stage is dependent upon water and nutrient availability. So if the water and nutrients aren't available, then that sporophyte stage may wind up being quite a bit longer than it normally would. If conditions are good, then it's not going to stay in that stage nearly as long. They produce sperm with flagella that must swim through the water to reach the egg cell. Again, kind of emphasizing the importance of having that water available in these environments for seedless plants. Most seeds, right, we're going to be able to distribute them with the wind, or we're going to distribute them in fruit, or we're going to distribute them by sticking to an organism. Most of these organisms that we're discussing, they are reliant on water, and so they're going to have to grow in habitats where water is plentiful, right? Because if they have to have that water to be transported, then no water means no transportation. So again, they would, if the water's not available, they're going to stay stuck, kind of paused, if you will, in that sporophyte stage. There are separate male and female parts, and the mature sporophyte grows on top of the gametophyte part of the plant, which produces the spores that are grown into the gametophytes, and then they can be fertilized. No matter how these plants are doing this, the end result is the same. You're going to have fertilization, and you're going to produce new plants from that. The difference is, like I mentioned before, with seeding plants or plants that produce seeds, this is an evolutionary step. This is the next evolutionary step. So most of these plants that we've suggested, or we've talked about, the ferns, the mosses, came along early. They're kind of the original version of a lot of different plants. And as plants have evolved, they've kind of learned along the way that seeds are really the way to go. And beyond that, that flowers are even better because flowers attract pollinators. That allows the pollen to be exchanged between plants, so you're ensuring that you get a genetic cross between two different organisms, which again, as we've talked about many times, that's a really good thing because that increases genetic variation. And species, although they're unaware of it, they're constantly trying to get as much variation in their population as possible because that is going to make the species itself more stable and more able to withstand the changes that are going to constantly be occurring in the environment. But these seedless plants, they've been around for a very long time. Even though they developed earlier, they have a system that works, and it works for them. And even though it may not be as effective as their plants with seeds, the counterparts, like I said, it still works for them, and they've been around for a really long time, so they just keep doing what they're doing because it's working for them. I'll see you next time.